I remember the exact moment I first noticed something was off. Not just tired or stressed, but fundamentally different about how I felt in my own skin. It was early morning, sunlight spilling through the window, the familiar alarm buzzing harshly beside me. I moved to shut it off, but a heaviness seized my limbs, like I'd been wrestling with an invisible weight in the night. I wasn't just sluggish. My body felt distant, as if I was just barely here, flickering between wakefulness and exhaustion. At the time, I shrugged it off, blaming it on a tough week at work or maybe not enough sleep. But days turned into weeks, and that fog didn't lift. My workouts, once a source of strength and pride, left me drained more than energized. I found myself avoiding the mirror, not because I didn't like what I saw, but because I wasn't sure if the man reflected back was the one I recognized. The spark of drive and purpose that had fueled me seemed muted, as if a quiet voice inside had faded to a whisper I couldn't quite hear. Yet, everything on the outside looked fine. I kept going, kept pushing, kept checking boxes on a long to-do list. But inside, something was fraying. It was subtle at first. Little things. Morning erections disappeared, energy levels dipped when they used to soar early. My mind, usually sharp, felt clouded and slow to react. Social encounters lost their spark. I smiled, but it felt forced. It wasn't until a conversation with a close friend that the pieces started falling into place. He described the same sinking feeling, the same growing sense of numbness lurking just beneath the surface. We called it different things: burnout, stress, fatigue, but deep down we both sensed it was something more, something anatomical and primal. There's this silent state many men live in without even realizing it. The place where the body isn't fully alive but merely surviving. Not a dramatic survival, like fighting for life in a crisis, but a subtle, chronic mode where tension is the norm, alertness is on edge, and the body settles for conserving energy rather than thriving. It doesn't scream for attention. It just quietly erodes what makes us feel alive. Strength, drive, desire, clarity. I found myself trapped there, a prisoner of my own internal alarm system. The daily grind, the endless emails, meetings, the pressure to perform, had tuned my nervous system to a constant low hum of stress. I thought I was adapting, but really, I was muffling signals of a body calling out to be understood. It's like living under a fog bank that never lifts. You go about your day, but there's a distance, a disconnection from your own power. This isn't just about feeling tired. It's a gradual, deep withdrawal from the very things that define male vitality. For years, I pushed through, believing sheer willpower was all I needed. I thought resilience meant ignoring the signs until they broke me completely. But that quiet state within me was shrinking my capacity, dimming my essence, and lowering the tide of testosterone that once fueled my energy and confidence. The alarming part is that this state wasn't designed to drag on indefinitely. It's meant as a fleeting emergency, a biological pause to conserve resources and endure hardship. Yet so many of us, me included, have been stuck here for years, weaving survival into our daily fabric without realizing the real cost. We function externally, meeting commitments and fulfilling roles, but the internal life force is running low, quietly drained by constant, unseen pressure. The body sends signals if we listen: heavier fatigue after training, the feeling that rest doesn't replenish, moments when motivation slips through your fingers like smoke. These whispers, I learned, are warnings. They tell a story of a nervous system on high alert, a body convinced it's unsafe to invest in the full strength and potency it once held. And when the body feels unsafe, it doesn't waste energy producing the hormones that fuel manhood. I hesitated to admit all this at first. It felt like a personal failure, a weakness I hadn't anticipated facing. But recognizing it was the first real step out of the fog. I realized this wasn't about weakness. It was about a deeply ingrained biological response to an environment that had become too demanding. The journey ahead wasn't going to be about brute force or sheer discipline. It was about understanding, patience, and realigning myself with rhythms and conditions that allow real, vibrant energy to return. If you're standing where I once stood, sensing that silent survival mode inside but unable to break free alone, you're not invisible or alone. Something is calling for your attention. a quiet signal waiting beneath the noise of daily life. The very fact you're reading this shows a flicker of awareness, a yearning for something more than mere survival. Before we go deeper, I want you to pause and feel into your body for a moment. What is the most persistent sign that you're operating from a place of survival, not full living? Is it the fatigue that no coffee can fix? The lack of drive? The tension in your muscles that never quite relaxes? Whatever it is, naming it puts you one step closer to breaking free. This is more than just a conversation. It's an invitation to begin reclaiming your energy, your clarity, and your presence in your own body. And though the path won't be instant or simple, it's one we'll walk together. I've been where you are, in that silent survival zone, and I'm ready to guide us both toward a place where strength isn't just about endurance but about thriving fully as the men we were meant to be. I remember a night not long ago when I found myself staring out of my window, the city's glow painting long shadows across the room. It hit me. I was running on autopilot, moving through motions without genuine engagement or vitality. This numbness wasn't a sudden invasion but a gradual erosion that had crept in unnoticed. The way I was living felt like wading through quicksand, each step requiring immense effort, yet the landscape around me remained unchanged. In that moment, it became clear how subtle pressures had reshaped my internal landscape into an ongoing pattern of guarded withdrawal. What struck me profoundly was how this ongoing state functionally rewires priorities beneath conscious awareness. Instead of seeking growth, connection, or expansive experience, instinct quietly shifted gears to just keep the engine idling. Imagine a fortress with walls thickened over time, intended to protect but gradually cutting off fresh air and sunlight. That's what I was living in. A self-imposed confinement where my vitality was rationed and my potential quietly sidelined. I caught myself during a conversation with a close colleague. We were discussing ambitions and goals, but midway through, I noticed my responses felt rehearsed, stripped of enthusiasm, which surprised me. I asked myself, when did my fire dim into mere flickers? His earnest eyes reflected his own struggle, and I realized this wasn't isolated. This muted state was an epidemic among men trying to juggle endless expectations. Facing deadlines, commuting, family demands, and unrelenting digital stimuli created an environment where rest became a foreign concept. Instead, pockets of downtime were cramped and restless, filled with anxiety or distractions. This cacophony drowned out the soft signals urging renewal and growth. I envisioned my inner landscape like a well-tended garden left untended. Once fertile soil now cracked, plants stunted, waiting for nourishment. More perplexing was the illusion of control I clung to. Despite fluctuating energy and clarity, I convinced myself I was adapting and thriving. But deep down, this was a defense mechanism, a mirage masking exhaustion. It was like holding a fragile flame against the cold wind, knowing it required shelter and care, but stubbornly exposing it to the storm. One afternoon at the gym brought this realization into sharper focus. Training used to fuel me, but now it drained me. My usual routine felt foreign, and muscles that once responded with ease rebelled under strain. I noticed my breathing shallow, pulse erratic, subtle signs of chronic strain rather than growth. Effort no longer translated into empowerment but exhaustion disguised as progress. This shift isn't birthed by sudden disasters but by a web of incremental habits and exposures. Chronic mental fatigue from relentless stimulation, hurried meals devoid of nourishment, screen-hypnotized evenings replacing genuine rest, all build up and compound. Worse still, cultural undercurrents idolize pushing through pain and dismiss taking moments to rebuild or recalibrate as a luxury. I caught myself buying into this rhetoric, swallowing pride instead of seeking balance. During a rare weekend hike, surrounded by towering trees and the steady rhythm of the creek, I realized how disconnected I'd become from natural cycles. Nature pulses with ebb and flow, growth, rest, renewal intertwined. Yet, my internal rhythms defied this orchestration, clinging to a constant state of alertness and tension. I understood then that reclaiming vitality meant not only changing external habits but relearning an ancient dance with time and energy. Later that week, a conversation with my partner peeled back another layer. She gently observed that my usual spark, the confident eye contact, playful banter, had dimmed. Her words touched a tender spot, a reminder that the way I carried myself influenced the atmosphere around me. This wasn't only about me. It affected relationships, presence, and how I engaged with the world. A whole dimension of life seemed muted, waiting to be awakened. I began journaling these experiences, each entry a thread unraveling this intricate pattern of quiet decline. Writing allowed me to face truths I often avoided, like recognizing how avoidance of emotions and relentless doing perpetuated a cycle of depletion. It was confronting discomfort that opened the door to reimagine what living fully could mean. One morning, I caught a glimpse of myself in a store window, noticed the set of my jaw, the tension in my shoulders, and it was a stark portrait of endurance, not ease. I resolved then to shift from mere function to flourishing, to return to a state where presence was vibrant, where my essence thrived rather than merely survived. This awakening didn't come wrapped in fanfare, but in subtle nudges, moments of clarity amid the haze. When you confront these quiet urgings honestly, you begin to understand that vitality isn't granted. It's cultivated, like a fragile flame requiring steady tending. It called for integrating rituals that honored rest, movement that replenished rather than depleted, and mental boundaries that shielded from endless bombardment. If you sift through your own daily rhythms, can you identify where your energy leaks? Maybe it's in endless notifications, obligations that drain without purpose, or internal dialogue that whispers doubt. These are the cracks allowing this worn pattern to persist. Recognizing them is the key to rebuilding robust foundations, a space where true masculine vigor can grow beyond temporary perseverance. I'm learning to listen differently now, to honor the subtle language of vitality, not just pushing past limits but sensing when to retreat, recharge, and advance with renewed strength. This reorientation feels less like conquest and more like a return home, a familiar place that had been obscured but is always waiting beneath the noise. In stepping into this rhythm, I'm discovering a wellspring of power that no longer feels borrowed or fragile, but intrinsic and enduring. There was a moment when I realized that my constant sense of tension wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a full-scale conversation my nervous system was having on a level I hadn't fully grasped before. One evening after a long day, my pulse hammered not from exertion, but from relentless stress signals that never ceased. It felt as if my internal alarm light was stuck on red, signaling danger when nothing immediate threatened me. I tried to shut it off, but the wires were frayed, continuously firing without pause. What struck me profoundly was how much my daily habits were feeding this relentless buzz. The relentless back and forth of notifications, rapid consumption of news, and endless multitasking wired me deeper into this fidgety existence. I recall sitting at my desk, attempting to read a book, only to be pulled away repeatedly by pings and chimes demanding my attention. It felt like trying to focus in a crowded cafe with people shouting around me. Every fragment of attention stolen piled up quietly, fragmenting my mental space and fueling that chronic hyper-alertness. At night, the struggle amplified. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, heart racing as if chased, replaying the day's pressures on endless loop. Sleep, which is supposed to restore and repair, became elusive, an adversary instead of an ally. Nights stretched, and mornings came heavy with fog. I caught myself growing irritable, less tolerant toward those I care about, as if a thin thread inside me was unraveling with every passing hour. An experience several weeks later made the situation painfully clear. I tried an early morning swim, hoping the cold water would revive me, but as I moved through the stillness of that lonely pool, the exhaustion weighed down every stroke. Inside, a voice whispered how prolonged tension had muted my natural rhythm. My muscles stiffened, breath shallow, and my mind distracted. It struck me that I had been pushing through days at a survival tempo rather than thriving in a state of ease and flow. What few recognize is how deeply chronic nervous system dysregulation reshapes hormonal landscapes. Stress hormones like cortisol become the main actors, overshadowing hormones that define masculine energy and vitality. I wasn't just fighting fatigue. I was caught in a biochemical standoff where the body deprioritized regenerative processes in favor of constant vigilance. This explained the persistent drop in my vigor, the diminished interest in activities I previously found electrifying. On one particularly raw afternoon, I decided to record my thoughts in a quiet room lit softly by late afternoon sun. I spoke aloud, imagining a dialogue between my mind and my deeper feelings. "Why do you keep fighting so hard when the fight wears you down?" I asked myself. The answer wasn't a clear sentence, but a profound silence filled with tension and weariness. In a way, it was a call to surrender, the kind that asks not for defeat, but for acceptance and redirection. Discovering practices that communicated safety to my nervous system, rather than stress, began to reshape my experience. I ventured into breathing techniques that felt almost foreign at first, slow, deliberate inhales paired with longer exhales, allowing my chest to loosen and my mind to descend from its frantic heights. The first time I fully slowed down, it was like a dam cracked inside, releasing a rush of relief I didn't realize I had hoarded for years. Nature became an unexpected teacher. I remember walking barefoot along a shaded path, the cool earth underfoot grounding me. The rustle of leaves breathed a rhythm that seemed to synchronize naturally with my exhalation. These moments weren't just peaceful escapes. They were small recalibrations sending a message of calm to my nervous circuitry. I began to notice a shift, invisible at first, a softening of the edge where relentless tension once ruled. I also observed how interaction with others changed as my internal tension eased. Conversations blossomed with more authenticity and warmth. The harsh judgments I often cast on myself mellowed into gentler acceptance. I realized the persistent inner battle wasn't a necessary condition for survival or achievement, but a trap I had stepped into unknowingly. As weeks passed, the slow rebalancing ignited dormant layers of motivation and presence. Yet it remained delicate work. I had to remain vigilant in protecting these small victories from daily stressors seeking to reclaim dominance. But even on harder days, the knowledge that relief was possible, that I could shape my internal climate, propelled me forward. Now, consider how this applies when you face overwhelming days packed with pressure and relentless demands. Can you trace how your automatic reactions maintain tension instead of allowing release? Recognizing these patterns opens the door to cultivating a sanctuary within, a place where equilibrium replaces exhaustion. The journey isn't about forcing change in a single moment, but building a mosaic of intentional practices that signal safety and encourage restoration. Understanding the dialogue of your own nervous orchestration can transform how you approach challenges. In my own experience, embracing that inner language revealed avenues previously obscured by stress and fatigue. The hidden messages carried wisdom about when to lean in and when to retreat, when to engage fiercely and when to nurture gently. Mastering this subtle dance restored a sense of agency that was absent for far too long. Ultimately, this chapter rewires more than physical responses. It unearths a profound trust in your capacity to regulate internal states, to move out of constant tension into thriving energy. It's a reclamation of belonging inside oneself, a quiet revolution turning endless urgency into grounded presence. And as I walk this path, I invite you to listen deeply, to answer your own body's whispered calls for balance with courage and compassion. I never thought a simple walk through an old neighborhood park would reveal something so profound about how I'd been living. The sun was low, casting long golden fingers through the trees, and the air carried a faint crispness I hadn't noticed in months. As I moved slowly along the worn path, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a rush of energy or an immediate awakening. Instead, it felt like a gentle loosening, like shackles quietly undoing around my chest. Each step invited a deeper connection, not just with the surroundings, but with the layers of tension I had unknowingly packed inside. It struck me that throughout my life, I had rarely given myself permission to simply be. Instead, every waking moment felt engineered for output, work, exercise, social performance, without allowances for genuine ease. This walk was different. It wasn't a checklist or a means to an end, but a deliberate retreat into stillness that carried with it the subtle message that rest isn't optional. It's essential. As I stopped beneath an ancient oak, I let my breath deepen, and waves of awareness spread through me. I became aware of scattered pockets of resistance within muscles and a habitual clenching of my jaw, evidence of a constant inner hold. What this experience revealed is that vitality doesn't flourish in constant motion alone. It requires intervals of surrender, moments where defenses drop, and openness prevails. It reminded me of the ocean's rhythm, how its waves recede to preserve strength before surging forward with renewed force. This cycle of engagement and retreat isn't weakness but a natural blueprint for sustainable energy. For so long, I had seen withdrawal as failure when it was actually a critical phase of restoration and power. Later, over a shared meal with an old friend, our talk unfolded in a way that peeled back layers I rarely exposed. We exchanged stories not about accomplishments but about fatigue, struggle, and the silent unraveling many men endure. She pointed out how many of us are prisoners to an internal script that glorifies constant hustle, tying worth to relentless activity. I felt a pang of recognition. I had been dancing to that tune while neglecting the silence between the notes, where resilience is regenerated. This dialogue sparked a realization. Reclaiming spirited vitality means learning to interpret subtle internal cues that signal a need to pause, not as surrender, but as strategy. I began to notice a different kind of inertia, the sluggishness born from overstimulation, emotional exhaustion, and inadequate recovery masquerading as mere tiredness. It became clear that honoring these signs would demand expanding my emotional vocabulary and cultivating self-awareness beyond physical symptoms. One morning, I tried an exercise that I had avoided for years. Sitting still in complete darkness, eyes closed, doing nothing but tuning into sensations within. At first, restlessness clawed at my focus, a buzzing urge to fill the silence with distractions or action. But after several deep breaths, a profound softness emerged, a spaciousness within that contrasted sharply with my habitual urgency. In that quiet space, I glimpsed what had been extinguished beneath layers of restraint. Curiosity, creativity, a latent spark waiting patiently. That afternoon, I sketched a simple diagram mapping out factors disrupting flow in my life. Pressure to perform, digital overwhelm, emotional suppression, and the inability to ask for help. By charting these interconnections, I could begin dismantling habits piece by piece. A giant emerged from the shadows, my resistance to vulnerability, which disguised itself as strength but fed exhaustion. Admitting this felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, but it also opened doors that had long been barricaded. The following days brought small breakthroughs. Incorporating brief mindful pauses during hectic schedules, I felt subtle shifts, a tightening easing in the shoulders, a dulled mind sharpening, a fragmented sense of self knitting back together. These pockets of presence became my secret weapons, reaffirming that healing energy thrives on intentional attention to moments most overlooked. Another pivotal moment came unexpectedly during a community gathering. When I spoke honestly about these struggles, I witnessed empathy ripple through the room, dissolving the isolation I'd silently carried. Stories surfaced, others' experiences of quiet depletion and reemergence, painting a mosaic of shared human endurance and revival. It was an embrace without judgment, proof that the path toward internal freedom is rarely walked alone. As I kept navigating this terrain, I understood that reclaiming vigor involves decoding a complex interplay between external demands, internal scripts, emotional wounds, and physiological responses. It's a layered process requiring patience, curiosity, and courage. Change doesn't come from willpower alone but from embracing paradoxes. Strength in softness, movement in stillness, and growth in surrender. Now, when I reflect on this journey, I see how essential it is to cultivate an inner environment rich with compassion and awareness, allowing natural energy cycles to resurface. I invite you to experiment with moments of intentional rest, tiny islands of peace amid chaos, and observe how they ripple into your sense of aliveness. Notice what emerges when you stop battling unseen pressures and instead lean into your own rhythms. What stories does your inner world begin to tell when you meet it openly and without resistance? The answers lie there, quietly waiting to be heard. Reflecting on this journey so far, I find myself standing at an unseen crossroads, the air thick with possibility yet tinged with a quiet urgency. It's as if the paths before me wind through a forest where shadows and light dance in nuanced rhythms, sometimes deceptive, sometimes revealing. Each step I took peeled back layers not just of fatigue or tension, but of intricate tapestries woven deep within me, echoing stories I hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. There's a gravity here that pulls me inward and simultaneously urges me outward, creating a subtle tension between surrender and action. I remember the sensation of sitting with uncertainty, resisting the urge to leap toward quick fixes or superficial answers. Instead, I learned to inhabit that space of not knowing with a kind of deliberate attention, like waiting for a wave to crest before catching its momentum. It wasn't an easy posture, demanding both patience and courage, a willingness to confront a strangely quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. This tempest wasn't loud or dramatic, but relentless. A slow erosion of vitality that whispered questions instead of shouting commands. In these moments, I heard an unfamiliar language emerging, an internal dialogue stitched from whispers and hesitations that invited me to explore what lies at my core. This language was subtle, weaving in threads of vulnerability and strength, challenging me to relinquish old narratives that no longer served. It felt as if an invisible compass was guiding me, not toward destinations marked by external accolades or accomplishments, but toward something more elemental, a reclamation of presence, grounded in authenticity rather than performance. There were times when the pull to retreat into familiar patterns, busy schedules, relentless doing was strong, a siren beckoning with the false promise of control. Yet deep inside, a countercurrent was growing, urging me to trust rhythms that honor depth and replenishment. The delicate tension between these impulses created a fertile tension, inviting me to reimagine what resilience truly entails. It wasn't about unyielding toughness or unrelenting grind. Instead, it sought integration, a seamless dance between energy and recovery, tension and release. I often found myself by a quiet window during twilight hours, observing how the fading light softened the edges of the world outside, blurring distinctions and inviting reflection. Those evenings mirrored an internal shift, where the rigidity of old defenses dissolved enough to reveal a realm suffused with possibility. It was as though the dusk carried a message encoded in its golden hues. Transformation seldom announces itself with fanfare but unfolds steadily, quietly, in the space left by letting go. Conversations along the way unfolded like unexpected gifts, moments of resonance that awakened dormant aspects within me. Some words shared by others struck chords that few could hear, yet their echoes lingered, weaving a richer understanding of what it means to inhabit this complex tension of endurance and awakening. These exchanges were not mere dialogue. They were encounters with facets of my own being reflected back through empathetic eyes, urging me toward a fuller embodiment of strength informed by softness. The process revealed itself as layered and intricate, defying linear progression. There were days when progress felt tangible, a surge of clarity breaking through the fog, while other times the path seemed obscured, swallowed in mist. Yet through both ease and resistance, I came to recognize that true transformation often unfolds in cycles, spirals winding deeper into self-awareness, looping back with new insight and renewed intention. I became increasingly sensitized to undercurrents within, not as problems to fix but as messengers carrying wisdom long overshadowed by distractions and obligations. A curious shift took hold, replacing self-judgment with curiosity, rigidity with openness. It was a quiet revolution that gradually dismantled the barriers between guarded survival and expansive living. What once seemed like immovable walls softened into thresholds awaiting passage. As I sit with this unfolding awareness, I realize the journey ahead demands neither haste nor harshness. It calls instead for tenderness, an invitation to meet all parts of myself with respect and patience, honoring the paradoxes within. It asks for both humility and boldness, a willingness to inhabit discomfort as fertile ground for growth. In this way, each moment becomes an opportunity to translate insight into embodiment, transforming abstract understanding into lived experience. This evolving relationship with myself feels less like mastering a puzzle and more like learning a dance, one where attunement and response create fluid harmony rather than static control. The dancers on this stage are varied. Resilience steps forward, vulnerability twirls alongside, and strength finds shape not by dominance but through balance. Witnessing this interplay deepens my appreciation for the subtle alchemy at work when tension and ease coalesce to generate new life within. I invite you to linger here beside me in this space of unfolding and anticipation, where the threads of inquiry and awakening intertwine. There is a palpable energy humming beneath the surface, a readiness to move beyond patterns that have long constrained us toward a terrain ripe with possibility. The horizon glimmers faintly in the distance, not as a fixed endpoint, but as an invitation into continued exploration and profound reconnection. There was a quiet evening when I finally allowed myself to slow down, not out of obligation, but out of a deep, almost urgent need to listen. The air around me was still, and the usual blur of thoughts began to dissolve, revealing a clearer space within. In that rare stillness, I confronted an essential truth that had been silently shaping so much of my existence. Endurance that doesn't acknowledge limits quietly erodes the essence of who I am. I realized that surviving day to day, pushed by endless demands and unrelenting tension, formed a veil that kept me from fully inhabiting my own life. I can see now how, over time, a pattern had emerged, a reflex that set my energy reserves on hold, holding back parts of myself from unleashing their full force. It was survival disguised as strength, an internal agreement to settle for just enough to keep up appearances. But this subtle concession wasn't benign. It acted as a slow leak in the reservoir of vitality, sapping power that once propelled me toward growth, desire, and presence. There was no dramatic collapse, no singular failure, only the quiet diminishing of fire, smothered by constant low-grade strain. More than once, I questioned whether this was simply the price to pay for living in a world that demands so much. Yet, as I peeled back these layers, a different story emerged. One of possibility to reclaim aliveness by tuning into unrecognized signals and honoring the rhythms that replenish life's breath. It became clear that the absence of immediate crisis doesn't preclude a profound internal emergency, a depletion that happens in slow motion, its contours easily overlooked because it hides in plain sight. Sitting in a moment of reflection, I remember telling a close friend, "I think I've been living halfway, not fully asleep, but not awake either." The honesty resonated deeply between us, exposing a collective experience too often ignored. What if the widespread fatigue and muted desire we witness isn't a sign of weakness but a call to reconnect with a deeper, wiser source of strength? What if real power emerges from learning to recognize when to push and, critically, when to surrender? This insight opened a new chapter, a recognition that genuine vitality isn't a fixed state to be forced or manufactured. Instead, it's an unfolding dance with attention and care, a willingness to embrace vulnerability as an entry point into endurance that sustains rather than depletes. The fierce inner tension gave way to a gentler, more fluid presence that invited me not to armor up but to soften, to open, to move from survival into invitation. I recall a day when, despite the noise of life pulling me in every direction, I chose to sit quietly and breathe with intention. The practice wasn't magic. It was subtle and patient, a gradual coaxing of energy back into circulation. What surprised me was how little this required in sheer effort, yet how grand the unfolding was. A slow blooming of clarity, a return of appetite for possibility, a reawakening of the hunger for life. The lesson I carry with me now is this: resilience forged in isolation and endless striving is fragile. True strength grows from weaving moments of calm into the fabric of our days and creating environments that invite replenishment. Reclaiming presence means reclaiming the right to inhabit every cell with awareness and acceptance, letting go of chipped expectations to embrace authentic flourishing. I sense this is not the end of a battle but the beginning of an ongoing conversation. A dialogue that asks me to be both gentle and vigilant, to hold tenderness and ferocity side by side. There is no final destination here, only a continual unfolding toward greater alignment with the vitality inherently within reach when armored defenses relax. If you find yourself echoing the quiet struggles that propelled me here, I offer this. Lean into the spaces that beckon for ease. Listen deeply to the whispers calling for restoration. Begin to cultivate practices that honor rhythm and renewal. In doing so, you don't just break free from a cycle of diminishing returns. You rediscover what it means to occupy your presence fully with courage and grace. And as I write these words now, I feel a quiet hope stirring. A promise that the path out of exhaustion and toward vibrant living isn't found in battling harder, but in awakening steadily. There is no rush, only the unfolding capacity to return, not to what was lost, but to what has patiently awaited your arrival all along.